Record to the cloud. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and welcome to this event for the 2020 Central Wisconsin Book Festival. My name is Chad Daly. I'm one of the committee members. My co-host and fellow committee member, Danielle Hale, is also with us this evening to help keep things moving along, as are our two guests, Steve Hanna and Tiffany Midge. Very happy to have them with us. And we'll have just a short introduction and a few bookkeeping things to mention and all of that. But first, going to play just a 1-minute video thanking our sponsors, and we will be right back.
Welcome to the 2020 Central Wisconsin Book Festival. This week of amazing events is possible only because of the support of our sponsors, which include
Marathon County Public Library,
the Friends of the Marathon County Public Library,
the MCPL Foundation,
the Community Arts Grant Program
of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin,
with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, which is a state agency,
the Community Foundation,
and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation,
the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service,
the Merco Foundation Fund,
Wisconsin Public Radio,
the Master Gardener Program of Marathon County,
North Central Area Congregations Organized to Make an Impact,
or Naomi,
and Yankee Bookstore.
Thank you to all of our friends and partners who make the Wisconsin Book Festival possible.
And we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Before I introduce our guests more properly, just a quick note. You are all muted, except for us. We're going to try and keep it that way, just to keep the conversation going. Your videos are on, your cameras are on, or at least you have the option to turn your cameras on or off if you want. You also, in the upper right corner of your screen, have the option to choose between a gallery view so you can see everybody, or a speaker view, which highlights the person who is speaking. So you can play around with that if you want. We have some questions of our own to ask our guests, but you are welcome to ask questions as well. If you hover your cursor toward the bottom of the screen, you will see the chat option, and you can click on that, and that is how we will take questions for our guests. So if you have a question for our guests, feel free to type it into the chat and we will pass it along. Our guests this evening, Tiffany Midge and Steve Hanna. Tiffany Midge is a writer of poetry, journalism, op-eds, humor, and Twitter feeds. Her writing has appeared in publications such as The Butter, Waxwing, and McSweeney's. She is the author of the award-winning poetry collection, The Woman Who Married a Bear, the memoir, Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's, and the forthcoming poetry collection, Horns. Our other guest, second but not least, Steve Hanna, has worked as a journalist for CBS News and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and wrote the syndicated column State of Mind for many years, which was collected into a recently published book called Dairylandia. He was also the CEO of the satirical news outlet The Onion, and has won a number of awards for his work, including Midwest Book Award for Travel Writing for Dairylandia. And before we move on, both of our guests this evening will have their own solo events. Steve will join us once again at 10 a.m. on Saturday to talk more about Dairylandia, and Tiffany will join us at 3 p.m. on Sunday to talk about her memoir, Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese. So welcome to you both. Thank you both for being here. And I'm going to ask them to unmute. Let's see.
Does that work?
Yep, there we are.
We can hear you.
All right.
It's a pleasure to be here, except I'm in my basement, so I'm really not anywhere that I haven't been lately. It also
Tiffany,
occurred,
I think the same with you. You and Danielle's conversation, you've become a master of the stay at home.
yeah, well, it also occurred to me that with all the news shows I watch these days, that everybody who's anybody, you know, stacks all the books they own. Tiffany, you did a particularly good job of this.
I know, I worked on it all day.
Yeah, to show how, because I think that says instantly there must be a consultant out there somewhere who says put all the books behind you, and people will think immediately, really smart. That's a really smart person.
So Steve, instead of a bunch of books, you just have one really big one behind you
A friend
there.
of mine had that blown up, the copy of my book. So I thought I finally get around to using it. So I put it behind me, and that's as close to being really smart as I'll get, frankly.
Well, so we are here tonight to talk about humor. Both of you write in different ways and utilize humor in different ways in your writing. I guess we can start with a very broad and entirely subjective question. What do you find funny? What do you find humorous? Maybe in terms of other people's writing, but when you are sitting down to write something yourselves, is there something that makes you laugh that maybe doesn't make other people laugh? Or I guess the two-part question: what do you find humorous in the writing of others, and what comes out of your own brains that makes yourselves laugh, kind of at yourselves?
Yeah.
I think Steve has an advantage to that because he's from Wisconsin, which is like land of cheese.
Yes.
I think they're like the capital of the world of just cheese. So he has like a definite leg up with that.
That's only if you find cheese funny, Tiffany. Here in Wisconsin, we take cheese very seriously. So
Very seriously.
I never write anything entertaining about cheese, believe me. I wouldn't.
Not even American cheese? I mean, that's pretty funny.
We don't have that here in Wisconsin.
You don't have that.
If you write something derogatory about cheese, you will be run out of town with pitchforks and torches.
No, I had no idea.
Yeah, I'll take the question if you want me to start.
Sure.
Okay. Because I actually, for the last 40 minutes before I got on, I actually thought about this. And my experience with humor has been certainly in writing the column that I wrote, although some people didn't think it was all that funny, but my mother liked it. So that was important. But I have a line in my book that says that that after working at The Onion for 15 years and 12 of those years as CEO, there were really I thought there are two kinds of humor that I came to believe and entertained me anyway. And one of them was the kind of humor that that sort of went at deeper truths. And that's very much the Onion way of doing things. I can, if you want at some point, and you may not, and I won't be offended, I can explain how those brilliant comic writers do what they do, which in very brief terms is they write 1,200 jokes in the beginning of the week, which eventually only about 40 get published. And they work in a writer's room like, you know, they do on Kimmel or Colbert or wherever. And so everybody is picking away at everybody else's work. And it's really excruciating. And I used to, just 6 times a year, because the boss wasn't really welcome there all that often, I'd take somebody in there to watch them at work. And honestly, it was like watching paint dry. But what came out of it looked effortless and really it was hilarious. But it was a lot of work and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So that's one kind of writing that I'm familiar with, just because I oversaw that operation for years. The other kind is something that appeals much more to me, frankly. And that is if some comics are trying to get at deeper, you know, satirical truths, other people are sort of unintentionally funny, and they just make you want to spit out your beer. And those are the ones that I generally I've always been entertained by and attracted to. And to the extent that my book is funny at all, you'd have to, you know, if you ask my wife, she'd say, I hope I never have to read another line of that. But nevertheless, it was sort of regular folks who were unintentionally funny that were most appealing to me. You know, I can remember being out with a guy who was a professional rattlesnake hunter. And he was so excited about the fact that we were going to get some rattlesnakes. And I kept telling him that his name was Woodrow Wilson Roberts, good name. And I kept trying to explain to him that it was going to be a good column, but I was really hoping we wouldn't find any rattlesnakes, because rattlesnakes just scare the shit out of me. All snakes do. And he was, you know, about in his 80s, I think, at the time, and he kept saying to me, you know, I know boys, and I was in my 40s, and he said, and although you're a boy who's scared of snakes, I know that you're a boy who can learn to love snakes. And I said, Woody, I'm not that boy, trust me. And when we went out hunting, and I'll turn this over to Tiffany just in a moment, but we couldn't find a rattlesnake anywhere, and he was so disappointed, and I was so relieved that at one point he turned to me as we were going through the hills and dales of southwestern Wisconsin, and he said, you know, he said, that's another good thing about rattlesnake hunting. And I said, what's that? And he said, it's never crowded. Never. And he wasn't trying to entertain me. He wasn't trying to be funny. And so I found that people who were just naturally funny, or just, you know, sort of extraordinary, ordinary people had much funnier things to say. I can say this now since we sold the company, The Onion, that is. But, you know, I kind of preferred that sort of humor to the multi-layered humor that was, you really had to, you know, you had to be, you know, you had to have your thinking cap on. No one says that anymore, but nevertheless, you know, that's it. That's my story.
I also find that explanation pretty on par with you know, my viewpoints on that. And a rattlesnake story is always hilarious.
Yeah.
But you know, today I was looking at these videos of ostrich eggs, and I thought, is there anything funnier than an ostrich egg? I mean, seriously. That's funny, and I'd want to write, you know, like a 1,000-word essay about ostrich eggs, maybe. I don't know.
What is it that's funny about an ostrich egg? I'm curious.
They're just funny. I don't know. Just the look at it. I just feel like it's just something. It's an untapped market for essays.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, for some reason, I keep wanting to pick on Wisconsin. And so I was trying to think of everything that I know about Wisconsin, having not really been to Wisconsin. And I remember I flew into San Francisco this one time, and the bus driver, the little van driver guy, it was one of those little vans, had picked up a bunch of, like, a group of women that were all from Wisconsin. I could tell because of the way that they were talking, and they kept making references to, you know, Wisconsin and places. And then, yeah. And then at one point in their conversation, they asked the van driver, they said, excuse me, do you know if there are any good Chinese restaurants in San Francisco? And it wasn't so much that it was funny that they asked that, although that was really hilarious. If you're from the West Coast, that's really funny. But it was the fact that the van driver and I exchanged a glance of like, you gotta be kidding me. Are you serious? And that was what was funny. But I don't know anything about Wisconsin as much as they would know anything about Chinese food in San Francisco, probably. Like, I would just think of, like, yeah. So that's about it. I don't know.
So it kind of runs the gamut then from, as Steve said, finding humor in some of the deeper truths versus, you know, at kind of the other end, just complete obliviousness to something, I guess, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I think there's an innocence about some humor, and that I find really attractive. I was looking at a couple of books that we published, a lot of books at the Onion, and I looked at just how precise and I remember publishing these books, and it was just excruciating. Every single word counted, and these people were really professional comedy writers. And some of them, I don't mean to suggest that they were not funny, because the people who worked at the Onion actually were not funny. The comedy writers, they're not a funny group of people, believe me. But when they would write a headline like Frito-Laysia breaks off diplomatic relations with Snackistan, that would take 15 writers 2 hours to come up with the exact wording of that. Whereas I put in my book, this sounds like a plug for my book. I'm not plugging it. Sort of, I'm plugging it, yeah. But I remember I wrote a column once about a lady named Emma Washa, and she was the oldest living newspaper columnist in America, and she lived down near Dodgeville in Wisconsin. And so she was just hilarious without even trying. She wrote a column for like 50 or 60 years of the social notes of this little place she lived in. And I went to see her, and at the time I had been I'd come up through the ranks, and I was.
It might be you, Steve.
Oh, that was me, sorry. And at the time, I completely lost my train of thought. Emma Washa, at the time I met her, I was already into my 40s, and I'd been the managing editor at the Milwaukee Journal for years. And, she was like 97. So she said, "Sit down, sonny boy." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Are you here to learn about writing?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be terrific." And she said, "Well, the first thing I'd tell you is don't be boring. There's enough boring crap out there in the world right now, and we don't need you to add to it." And I said, "Okay, I'll write that down." And then she said to me, another thing, she said, "If your next door neighbor goes to visit her cousin in Milwaukee, don't write about it, for crying out loud, until she comes back. Otherwise, you're just drawing a roadmap for a burglar." And those were the kind of comments she made. She said, "Are you writing that down?" And I'd been in the business for 25 years, and but she treated me like I was a rank amateur, and she didn't do it disrespectfully. She just did it because that's the way she was. And years later, I went back to see her. She was 105, and she was talking about she'd been invited to be on the Tonight Show, and she turned him down. She said, "It's just foolishness. Who's got time for that?" She was 105, living in a nursing home, and she said, "It takes a lot to turn my crank at 105. And she said, "It's like this morning, the nurse came into my room here, and she said, that columnist guy, Steve Hanna's coming to visit you. And so, I bet that's pretty exciting." And I said, "And what did you say to her?" And she said, "I told her that I thought it was nice, but I can't say I was all that excited. I think it's nice you're here, but, can't say I'm excited, really." I said, "Well, all right, well, you haven't thrown me out yet." So those kinds of things that people say very naturally, particularly old people, as I get older, I find are just totally unfiltered, far past the point where they care what anybody thinks about, what they have to. I mean, they believe people have an interest in hearing what they have to say, but they couldn't care less about whether you like them or not. So the older they were, the more unfiltered they were, and the more entertaining I found them. So.
And so, Steve, your column was about finding interesting people all across Wisconsin, and telling their stories. Tiffany, from what I know, and to be honest, Danielle is more well versed in your work than I am, although I'm trying to catch up. It seems like a lot of your writing deals maybe not so much with people, but I think you, it seems like you have no problem maybe poking fun at yourself or taking on stereotypes. You're a member of the Standing Rock Sioux, and so it seems you're willing to take on issues surrounding stereotypes of perhaps the Native American community. I'm thinking about the pumpkin spice piece that you wrote for McSweeney's. And so is that a fair assessment that your work is not so much in trying to find humor from other people, but maybe trying to put a humorous spin on social issues and maybe on yourself and the way that you view things? Am I?
Yeah, I mean,
am I close?
that was a weird sound. I would, it pretty much runs the gamut. It's interesting that you said not so much with people, because I don't mean to, like, you know, put you on blast here, but the beginning of my book has these really long personal essays that are basically character studies of just very strange people in my life. And they're very long essays as well. And one of them was a fellow that I knew in Bellingham. And so the whole essay is just about, my encounters with him and my friendship with him and the kinds of things that we would do. Because I hung around him because he was extremely funny. And I just would, wanted to go and do whatever it is that he was doing just so that I could get material. Because the things that he said was just like manna falling from heaven. Whether or not he intended to be funny, I don't know. He wasn't like a professional comedian, but he just ran a thrift store, and he let homeless people come and get clothes for free at his thrift store, and he would give clothes away for free. He was just a character. And then the other long essay is about my own father, who was very much, very eccentric, irreverent kind of, outlaw. I mean, almost literally, he was an outlaw. And I wrote this long travel narrative about visiting him in Thailand, where he lived for about 20 years, and just all of my perceptions and everything that I took in through that. So it would run like a gamut, of course. So characters, definitely, and social and political humor, and definitely Native American issues, and in popular culture and media, particularly. I make a lot of fun of how the media represents Native Americans, because that's just there's a lot going on there all the time, like practically every day there's like something new to comment on, or push back against, basically, and just make fun of. And yeah, pumpkin spice. Now that we're in the season, yay. McSweeney's, that was my first published piece with McSweeney's. And yeah, so that would, to answer your question, just, yeah. But characters are a really rich place to go, and political humor is another one that's represented quite a bit in the book too. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have started getting a couple questions from our audience, so I'm actually going to ask one of those for them. Tiffany, you just mentioned the essay that where you were speaking about the thrift store owner, right? Mm-hmm. And this question is about that particular essay, or the circumstances behind it, I think. So the question is, how did you decide to think of that as humor, or did you?
Well, I think just the nature of the thrift store owner. His name was Jimmy. His name was Jimmy Henry, and he had lived the last years of his life, I think, in Wisconsin or Michigan. I can't remember. Wherever Duluth is. I don't know where Duluth is.
Duluth is in Minnesota.
Okay. See, I mean, what do I know, right? One of those two. But yeah, he was a very funny person, and so just being around him, like I was saying before, I just hung around him because I liked that he was funny. And I wrote down things that he would say, and I would just follow him around just for material in an essence. I also really thought he was a wonderful person, and I thought he was really great. It wasn't just that I was just like following him for humor, but that's essentially what that essay is about. And that would have ticked off the, that would have been the impetus for that essay, is the fact that I thought that he was so funny. And being around funny people, it makes me feel funnier, because I don't feel funny. I feel like awkward, socially awkward. I sweat. I like get nervous, and I'm just extraordinarily like self-conscious. And I could never like be a funny person in person. Like I don't conceive of that happening for me. So I like being around other funny people because they make me feel more relaxed.
So this must be torture for you right
It is.
now.
I'm sweating. Yeah, I am.
Sorry we've done this to you.
I actually kind of have a question about that, whether or not you feel funny. And it's for both of you, both Steve and Tiffany. Do people expect you to be funny because you write funny things? And if so, I mean, Tiffany, you already touched on this, but like, how does that pressure, like, what does that pressure do to you, or how do you deal with it?
I don't think that it's pressure, because I don't think people are, I don't have expectations of other people being funny. If somebody writes humor, I think it would be a bit strange for me to say, well, then gosh, you must be really funny. Say something funny, like you're a court gesture and you're supposed to be on command or something like that. But I have a lot of different theories about people who write funny or people who are funny. I mean, they're usually, depressive, melancholy, sort of, down people. And the funny parts of them is just a way to compensate for that kind of stuff. And so that question, expecting people to be funny, and it touches too on what Stephen was saying about the Onion people not necessarily being like, the life of the parties. They're just very serious, very somber, writing their jokes. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that I don't like being around, like I like to go to comedy shows. I like to laugh. I like sitting around the kitchen table. I like watching comedies and stand up and things like that. Because, maybe I need it more than other people. Maybe I need the attention more than other people. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you that if you are the CEO of the Onion, as I was for 12 years, wherever you go, people think you have got to be just a scream, that every word that falls out of your mouth is going to be hilarious. And so I try to disabuse them of the notion really quickly that I said, I run the company. And some of them were familiar with the fact that I'd written a humor column for years. But generally I said, I've never written an Onion joke. But to Tiffany's point, and I think, segueing off something I said earlier, people who write comedy for a living are not a laugh riot. And I would agree with her 100%. When I first got offered the job to run the Onion, I thought, these are the funniest people I'm ever going to work with. And that was not the case. And you used words, Tiffany, a moment ago. I think you said manic depressive. And I mean, we had lots of people with issues who were, in person, they were not funny at all. It would be agony to go out and have a beer with them after work. But put them in a writer's room with a bunch of people, and they were absolutely brilliant. So I used to do, and they're also very shy. I found them to be very, very shy, which may or may not surprise you. And we went through, people who worked for the Onion, some worked for life there, but others, we had 3 or 4 people on the Colbert Show today, and we had our editor who's from sort of Chad, and Danielle, you're part of the world, up in north central Wisconsin. Todd Hansen was a really brilliant guy who grew up in Wisconsin Rapids, and our editor was Carol Kolb, who was just a wonderful comedy writer, and completely, whenever something was really inappropriate in the Onion, and I was going to hear from the public, because we had 35 million page views a month, you know, I don't, something really that I could never repeat on this, for example. And you know, I was running a company and we were living off advertising, and I'd go to the editorial office and say, you know, I mean, can you give me a break? I mean, who did this? I mean, and it would be something really distasteful. And it was almost always Carol, who went on to write for Modern Family. I think she still does.
Wow.
But one funny little story, if I may, Chad, I know you're wanting to move this along, but
No, it's fine.
oh, okay. So I used to give a lot of talks because the staff was so shy and actually not very good in public at all. And as you can see, I'm spectacular in public. So I had invitations, particularly when we were doing a comedy show, television show for Comedy Central at the time. So I was getting invitations all over the place. And once I got a call, just about 6 or 7 years ago, from the World Media Festival in Banff, Alberta. I mean, that's a big title, right? It's not as big as the Central Wisconsin Book Festival, but the World Media Festival. And they said that their keynote speaker was going to be Larry King, but he had come down with a cough or something. And so they called me and said, would you mind being the keynote speaker and replace Larry King? And I, you know, what's the proper response? First I said, you're kidding. And they said no. And it was right after, if you remember, there was a movie that won the Academy Award that year. It was called The Artist. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it was a completely silent movie where no one spoke. And so I put together a presentation that lasted for 45 minutes, and I never said a word. I used all the Onion props. You know, I think that was the year we announced that Kim Jong-un was the sexiest man alive. And unfortunately for the Beijing Daily News, they put it verbatim on the front page of the Beijing Daily News, and it ran for like 2 days, and they had photo spreads, 55 pictures of Kim Jong-un, until someone realized finally that someone said, you know, I don't think the Onion and the New York Times or the LA Times are not exactly the same. It's different. And I did get a call actually after a number of days when the Chinese finally figured out that this was not on the level. And the Chinese embassy called me and said, we figured you out. We know who you are. And I said, I'm not hard to find, you know, and I'm not very complicated on top of that. And they said, you make up news. This is long before Donald Trump decided fake news was, you know, saleable. You make up news and then you charge people advertising, and that's how you make money. You do this to make money. And I said, absolutely. You know, I mean, you're Sherlock Holmes. You're just brilliant. How could you? Anyway, I'll finish the original story. So I went to Banff and there were 2,000 people, and I made this presentation that I kind of stole from Hal Holbrook, who used to do Mark Twain Tonight, the one-man Mark Twain show. And I came out and I was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and a bow tie. And the guy who was the CEO of the biggest Canadian media company, he was introducing me. And I said to him, after you finish introducing me, when you step to your right and I come from behind the stage and you stick out your hand to greet me, I said, I will not shake your hand. And I'm just going to blow right past you and give my presentation. And so it went on for 45 minutes. All I did was use Onion jokes, you know, and and it was the strangest jokes would land, you know, really complicated jokes, not so much. But I remember I put on this gigantic, it was like a Cinemax screen. It said, it had a picture of an Amish guy in a buggy. I hope we don't have any Amish people who will be offended by this tonight. An Amish guy in a buggy going down the street, and the headline in like 72-point type said, Amish give up. And then the subhead said, this lifestyle is bullshit. And I mean, 2,000 people erupted. I never said a word. I didn't smile. In fact, I sat down and I had somebody that I knew call me. Told them to call me at a specific time and just chatted on the phone while I just changed the slides and the jokes. And this does have an ending, mercifully. At the very end of it, there's like a 4-day festival, and I had that silent speech, which the Canadians love. They're quiet people. And at the end of it, they've asked 2,000 people to vote on the best speech that was given. And they voted for my speech, and I'd never given a word. I never said anything. All I did was show up with a little remote in my hand. That was it. And I thought
tell other people's jokes
yeah,
or share other people's jokes.
Jokes. I mean, that's other good, you know, that's like my mother used to say all the time that everything will be funny eventually. So
well,
anyway.
but I think you both bring up good points about somebody who is or is not funny in person versus somebody who is funny on paper. And
yes.
I kind of wonder why that is. I mean, certainly people can be witty and quick with the tongue to crack a joke, but I think part of it might stem from, you know, and certainly if you both like to speak to this, with writing, you have a little more time to spend with it, and you're not just saying the first joke that comes to mind. You do have a little time to, I mean, I personally, whether they're funny or not, like I obsess over the simplest work emails. I will read through them like over and over, and yeah, for way too long. So, you know, I don't know. I think it's, there's a difference there between writing humor and, you know, Tiffany, whether it's, you know, something that you want to put up on Twitter or whatever, how much time do you spend, can you think of a particular joke or a particular tweet or something like that where it took a little time, and how do you know, like, okay, I'm ready to, I want this to be funny and it's as funny as I want it to be. I'm going to put it out there in the world. How do you know? I know that's
I have a standard joke for that. And it's basically, you know, I get up every morning and I get myself a big cup of coffee and I sit down at my computer and I scroll Facebook for the next 8 hours. And yeah, when it comes to tweeting, I mean, I'm not the only person that does this, and that's the funny. That for me, that's the joy of Twitter. A lot of people hate Twitter. They think it's, you know, a really toxic environment, and yes, that is true. But what attracted me to Twitter and what keeps me going to Twitter is I have my friends that are on there, and they're all doing jokes. And, you know, there's comedians or professional writers, and then just even poets. I mean, everybody's cracking a joke. And I love that. I love that about that. And I loved it even more when they only were allowed to have 40 characters. Because it just sort of, you know, I'm on to that. You know, I'm a poet. I have books of poetry published. I understand, you know, how to encapsulate a certain amount of syllables and characters into a small space. And so that's part of my answer, I guess, is the Twitter. Steve, do you tweet?
I used to. We had 10 million Twitter followers at the Onion, and some of the more embarrassing moments of my life involved our Twitter. If you Googled Steve Hand of the Onion Twitter, they're not things I'm going to discuss tonight ever again, hopefully, in my life, frankly.
That's what I love about the Onion, though, is that they don't, you know, they're just out there. They don't, you know.
Out there is an understatement, yes.
They don't mollycoddle. They're not politically correct. All the, you know, they just they go that extra. They go that extra, and I
hope you don't think that I'm trashing the Onion. I think it was a wonderful 12 years of my life. And it was a wonderful exit as well. You know, one of the things that I wanted to say is that, and I started to say before, is that, and Tiffany's already admitted she's never been to Wisconsin, but I grew up on the East Coast in the shadow of the Empire State Building. And I found the humor there is just as you'd expect it to be. It's loud and it's raucous and it's in your face. And when I got to Wisconsin, I found a different kind of humor entirely. And in a word, it was so extraordinarily understated. People were modest and people were humble. And I guess in that initially I was shocked at that. I only knew the loud part. And, you know, and people said things that I found, I think this is just my weird Irish Catholic heritage. And I had a weird Irish Catholic mother who had an extraordinary sense of humor. But I remember an incident where when I was out visiting my mother in New Jersey, and I wanted to, she was getting near the end of her life. And so we were watching television, and some guy in her neighborhood in New Jersey won $100,000 in the New Jersey lottery. And the guy got on and he sounded like one of the Sopranos, and he probably was. And he said, you know, it's unbelievable. It's huge, you know. He said, it's awesome. I mean, everybody knows I won the money, and, you know, they know I got the luck. I mean, I'm the guy. And, you know, he was just so utterly full of himself. He was just one gigantic New Jersey swollen toad. You know, grown up with thousands of them. And I went to write a column shortly thereafter to a place, an exotic city called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, where I don't know if any of you remember, but there was, when the Wisconsin lottery was really roaring, they had a place they called the Miracle Mile. And it was just a bunch of convenience stores and gas stations and Cenex, you know, and tire shops. But two people had won. I mean, they really hit they won the lottery, literally. And one was a guy who worked on the line at Mercury Marine, and he won $10 million. And I had just come from New Jersey, where the guy who won $100,000 is really the man. And I was interviewing this guy because a bunch of people had won money. And I said, you know, what are you going to do with $10 million? And he looked at me and he said, I think I'm going to buy one of those KitchenAid blenders. And I said, that's it? And he said, I like to cook. And so I then, on the very same day, went down the street, and there was a junior high school teacher in Fond du Lac who won $100 million. And this was the perfect encapsulation of my sense of Wisconsin humor. I said, $100 million, you know, you're probably not gonna have to teach junior high anymore. And he said, well, I don't think so. And I said, well, and in my best sort of Barbara Walters imitation, at the very end of the interview, I said, $100 million. I said, how do you feel? You know, the great Barbara Walters. And he looked at me and he said, not too bad. And then I said, not too bad? And he said, no, not too bad. Now, I found this to be telling about the sort of collective character of Wisconsin, which is a very understated place where people don't, bragging is not good form in Wisconsin. You know,
Sure.
If you win $100 million and you brag about it, somebody's going to take it away from you. I guarantee you.
Yeah.
But I found this kind of humor, this really understated humor, it's just like the snake hunter when he had nothing else to say to me and he said another good thing about snake hunting, you know, it's never crowded. You know?
Yeah.
And so when I got to by the time I got to the Onion, and they were mostly at the Midwestern people who had fled to New York by and large, but you know, if I had anything in common with them, and I did, of course, but it was they had a very understated, a wry sense of humor, and I mean, the flatter they could be, the funnier they generally were. So the loudest person in the room was a whisperer there, mostly.
Tiffany, you're in Idaho. Is there such a thing as a Western sense of humor?
I have no idea. I really don't.
That's a good answer.
I feel like an Idahoan. I feel like I'm more a Northwest person. because I was raised in Seattle area, and I moved out here 10 years ago. So I do know that I met some extraordinarily funny people while I was here. I mean, here now too. And one of them was my partner. And I didn't start writing humor until I started hanging out with him. And he was born in Idaho, actually born in Missouri, but he was raised in southern Idaho, Idaho Falls area. And I think he's hilarious. And so it's hard for me to say if Idahoans are funny or not. It depends. It depends where you are, I think.
I think a sense of humor has, at least in my experience, has an enormous, there's an enormous influence if you grow up with funny people. And people who even try hard to be funny. And as I said, I come from a very large Irish Catholic family, and you were expected to be funny. You needed to be funny to survive. And my mother was extraordinarily funny. I was talking to my sister the other night, and my mother had had impeccable timing. And so on my 45th birthday, my wife threw a surprise party for me. And in the middle of the party, there were 40 or 50 people there. And I was living in Milwaukee at the time. And I went to answer the phone because I thought it was my sister telling me that just to say happy birthday, old man. But instead she said, I wish that's why I was calling, but mom just died. And I had just talked to my mother a few days before, and my sister, so I was a little shocked, as you can imagine. But when I said a moment ago, everything is funny eventually, I was talking to my sister, and I really felt terrible about the fact that I hadn't been there, and my other siblings, which were legion, were all around the bed when my mother died. And they all said I was my mother's favorite, so that burned them forever, you know. But my sister said that just before my mother died, she said, my mother said, you know, if I have one regret in my life, I wish I was nicer to your father. And my sister said, oh, I mean, you were really nice to him, and he was so difficult. I mean, you know, he was a grumpy guy, he had a bad temper. And she said, you know, even when he was ill toward the end of his life, he preceded my mother. He said, and the doctor ordered you to make him every day tomato soup that was the blandest tomato soup imaginable with no salt in it. And he was on the strict diet. And my sister said, you knew he was going to be abusive. You knew he was going to be angry and unhappy. And yet you did it anyway because you loved him. And my sister said, my mother just had the tiniest of smiles that creased her lips at the end. And she said, it's not the way it happened. And she said, you know, I just couldn't take listening to him complain all the time. So for the last year of his life, I made that awful soup. And I put practically a pound of sugar in every single one, a pound of salt rather. He never knew. So I said to so that's everything is funny eventually. And I said to my sister, so we're dealing with the possibility that our mother murdered our father. And my sister said, yeah, I think it's possible he murdered our father. And then she said, but maybe justifiably. So I think, anyway, that was the sort of dark Irish humor that infected my family. I could give you 150 stories of things like that, but I do think it shaped the way I saw the world. I saw things that I looked for the humor all the time. I thought there was humor in everything, and my mother told me there was humor in everything, and I never doubted my mother. How's that?
That's good. That's good. Yeah, absolutely. We did have a question. I don't know if the person is still with us or not, but are there some other writers, funny writers, humor writers who inspire the two of you? Tiffany mentioned you have a lot of friends, people that you follow on Twitter who are funny. Others whose writing you enjoy and get inspiration from, and and challenge you to try and one-up them in the humor realm?
Well, I met some really fabulous television and content writers when I was in Los Angeles last October, and one of them is Jana Schmieding. She is a writer for an NBC Peacock television show called Rutherford Falls, and that has 5 different Native American comedian writers on the writing staff. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's kind of like a big coup for Native Americans, in television. And then the show that we had put on it has such a long title, but it's funny. It was the Christopher Columbus Smudging Spectacular is the short version. And it was a bunch of skits and comedies that a whole number of people put on at the the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater on Sunset. And that was super fun because the audience was absolutely loving it, and we had the best audience in the world. And it'd been a really long time since I had done any kind of stage or theatrical production, and that was super exciting, being able to stand in the wings and just being in that atmosphere of theater again. It was really, really funny. But insofar as the page, I can't go wrong with David Sedaris. I love David Sedaris, and Alexandra Petrie at the Post. She's absolutely brilliant. I love her to death. So those are just, a few people that I follow and that I enjoy quite a bit. Sarah Val. She's amazing.
Steve, what about you? Any writers that you follow, look forward to reading their work?
Well, I'd say that unquestionably the greatest influence on me and my interest in writing, humor was Mark Twain. We were not close friends, but I grew up reading Twain, and I thought and then of course I started reading him when I was in junior high school, and then 35 years later at the Onion, I think the Onion people are direct descendants of Mark Twain. I mean, he was a biting satirist, and I think he's the all-time best ever. I completely agree with Tiffany. I'm a huge David Sedaris fan. I also think David Sedaris is very funny in person. I saw a bit by him the other day in which he was. I'm actually getting ready to record that book. This book back here that you can get for $20.95. If you call me right now, it'll be an 800 number on the screen momentarily. But I just signed a contract with Audible to do it, and David Sedaris was actually talking about Audible, and when he did his first book for Audible. He got these terrible letters that came to his agent, and one of them came from a little kid who said, we had to listen to it in our classroom, and I felt really, first of all, it wasn't funny at all, and secondly, I felt really sorry for that old lady who read the book, who was forced to read it, and of course it was David Sedaris reading the book, and he's very thoughtful. And he's very funny. And I'm going to give you one throwback. Probably it was around, well, he's still around, but I thought Steve Martin was just terrific. And he's not only wonderful on stage, with SNL or in the movies, but he's a tremendously talented and funny writer. If you've ever read his essays in the New Yorker, he's a brilliant guy, and by his own admission, he's a guy who had no natural talent for comedy whatsoever. So if you want someone to encourage you, if you're a person who likes comedy and and people are telling you you're not funny at all, they told Steve Martin that for the longest time. They told David Sedaris that too. Hard to believe he can make having a a small tumor taken out of his side and fed to a snapping turtle funny, you know. Not funny anyway. He actually did it, you know. He allowed somebody to take it out of him. You know. So
And a
those-
boil that's on his rear end, on his tailbone, that he called a muscle. He called it
Yeah,
a muscle, and I about died.
yeah, he's and you know, there's, I think, apropos of something I said earlier, that was probably forgettable at the time, but I mean, he came from a family that, if you've read anything about him, I mean, his mother was just really funny. His dad was not funny, but his mother's funny, and all his sisters, you know, every one of them. I mean, those who are still alive.
His sister Amy is hilarious.
And
Love her stuff.
And you can find interviews that were. He wrote a book about comedy. He did a master class on comedy, one of those master classes, and he interviewed his sister Lisa, who he said is the funniest member of his family, about what it was like to be abused in his writings all these years, and she was terrific. So I guess the point I'm making is he was surrounded by people who saw the world in a weird way, and weird is funny to me. So there you go.
Speaking of things being weird and maybe kind of funny, one of the questions that has come in, is there anything about this year either one of you have found amusing? Anything about 2020 that you find funny?
Well, I kind of gave it away at the beginning. I think it's hysterical that all these virtual interviews on television, I have a lot of time to watch news shows, whether it's Face the Nation or Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour every night. And then, of course, Judy Woodruff has David Brooks and Mark Shields. And somebody, as I said earlier, I don't know if it was before we got on, somebody just told them, look, the most important thing for credibility is to look smart. And even if you're not smart, the thing you want to do is get at least 150 books behind you and make sure they're books that probably you've never read, you know. But so they've got Homer, they've got the Odyssey and the Iliad and things they haven't read since they were 15 years old. That, I think, is funny. I'm always squinting, trying to see what I just can't wait to find out that what Judy Woodruff has behind her is, you know, some Danielle Steele novel or something. But instead she has Grant and, you know, Destiny of the Republic and a lot of other high-minded things. But I think it's funny because I'm just guessing these people have not read these books. You know, these are all props. So that's not much, but it's all I got at the moment.
Yeah.
What about
Tiffany,
you?
what
Tiffany?
about you? Yeah.
Anything amusing from 2020?
Oh, the question. Yeah.
That was good right there. That was very good comic timing.
Yeah. Well, I've been writing, you know, I wrote a piece about it, but I should have reviewed it because it was basically just a bunch of jokes about, you know, being in what is it called? I keep thinking it's isolation, but they call it, huh?
Quarantine?
Yeah, the quarantine, the quarantine. Somebody was calling it quarantine. And then another person was calling the pandemic the pandy. And I was like so like taken aback by that. I just thought, really? We're gonna call it the pandy, like it's, you know, a zoo animal or something from Disneyland. But at the same time now I'm calling it the pandy and I'm calling it the quarantine. And you know, there's that adage that I heard somewhere about how domestic partners or married couples are basically protectors of each other's solitude, and they definitely didn't think that in the midst of a quarantine, because that's like so often I'm just like I'm never alone anymore. I used to have a lot of downtime, a lot of alone time, and I don't live in like a big house. I live like a college student, you know, in like a small basement apartment with my boyfriend. And yeah, so that's been a challenge. Just trying to find time. I like it when things are completely still and completely quiet, and I like isolation. he went to go cat sit for a week, and I was like, wow, you got to go do that. You got to go cat sit. And that was a really nice breath of fresh air.
I'm hard pressed to find really almost anything that's funny. I could spend time talking about what's in the news and pronouncements that are being made and promises. Some of those are really funny in my estimation. Absurd is a better word, but this is not going to go down as the funniest period in American history, I have a feeling. But
losing my sense of humor.
I think this too will end. Personally, it's going to end a lot later than my children would like. But that's a tough question, and I don't think there's a good answer to that.
Sure. Well, we can move on then. We can, if there are more questions that people have, by all means, submit them in the chat. We did have one that we haven't gotten to yet. Tips, tricks, advice, anything to share with young writers who are trying to develop their own voice, and especially their own humor writing, their own voice when it comes to writing humor. Any sage advice, words of wisdom, tips, tricks?
I think I think the best piece of advice that anyone ever gave me about writing was, and this I think is applicable to humor writing as well, is well, two pieces of advice. One was read. Anybody who wants to write, this is good because the library is sponsoring this, of course. I should wish I could say I thought this up before, but honestly, read and read and read and read. I mean, I think any writer who is worth his or her salt, who, when you're not writing, you're reading, that's what you ought to be doing. You can learn an awful lot about your own voice from reading about other people. The other part is to write, and is to stop talking about how you're writing. I know people who have never had anything published, and they're still talking about how difficult it is, and the muse isn't speaking to them at the moment, and it's just a colossal mound of horseshit. They just never get around to doing anything, and they're just posers and pretending. So people who really are going to write for a living, and it's hard to write for a living, it's a lonely existence, but I would say get there and write and write and write. And if you can, if you're more disciplined than I am, set up a schedule where you make yourself write every single day. If I had a nickel for everybody who said to me, I'd love to do what you're doing, except I've got to work. And I said, well, I'm actually getting paid for this. This is what I do for work. But I think the first part is the most important part. That is read, 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 and read broadly. And if you're meant to do it, you'll get inspired eventually.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Tiffany?
I would basically just suggest the same, to read and to find things that interest you. If you just focus your subject matter on particular topics, like for instance, ostrich eggs, or working at a chimpanzee sanctuary, working with children, just strange or unusual things, just expose yourself to them, and look for that humor, but definitely follow your interests and follow strange topics, and strange subject matters, things like that, and hang around funny people. Make friends with funny people. That's a good thing. Follow them around and steal all their jokes.
That's good advice. Borrow heavily.
But I started years ago with a blog. Once upon a time, people used to have blogs online, and they would hook up with everybody else's blog, and so it became like a community of blogs, and people were really passionate about their blogs, And they were super fun to read, everyone's comings and goings and impressions every single day. So, and they would read yours and they would give you feedback, and you would read theirs, you give them feedback, and it was just really terrific. We're not doing that anymore. Now we're online, of course, and we're doing Twitter, and we're not writing like essays the way we used to. We're just writing like 40-character tweets and being online here. And that's just a little bit different than sitting down to your blog and sharing, a piece of writing, basically an op-ed. But that's an incentive, and write an op-ed, write for your school newspaper, and find that incentive. Eventually someone will give you $20 for your op-ed. And then eventually, if you keep at it, you'll eventually get like maybe $100 for your op-ed. But that's great incentive, especially if you have like, a regular gig doing that. My book was basically the culmination of 18 months of writing an op-ed for Indian Country Today. Some people liked what I did, and they let me write a regular column. And that was a terrific incentive for me because I had to turn it in. It was an assignment, and that's very big from when you're just doing it for fun. If you have to turn it in because somebody's going to write you a check, that is a huge incentive. So, work your way up to that and find people to read your work and share your work. That's a huge incentive, is having other people share and give feedback.
I've always heard that there are writers groups everywhere, in this little county I live in Wisconsin, in cities, and I lived in New York for a while, and I lived in LA, and I lived in Dublin, Ireland, and there were writers groups everywhere. And I was always writing to make a buck, frankly. It's terribly crude, of course, but I needed the money. So that's how I got started in journalism. I wanted to be a journalist, but I also needed to get paid. But I'm told from people who have been part of writers groups that, and they really never had any great desire to make money off of it, which I thought was a wonderful luxury. I was envious, frankly. But they had a supportive group around them, and they shared their work, and they read it aloud. And I think that's a wonderful experience. And I'm told, if there are groups in my little neighborhood here in rural Wisconsin, in this county, I think there are groups everywhere, and I would join them. And I think people are supportive and sympathetic. And when the first time you get called upon to read what you've done that week is probably pretty frightening for some people, but it's I think you can console yourself in knowing that everybody around that table feels the exact same way. It's like being called on in parochial school, where I went, by the nuns when I hadn't done the homework the night before. I would suggest the writers ought to do their homework. How's that? I learned that from experience, and I have the bruised knuckles to show it. I wish I had somebody asked me yesterday if I would have ever become a journalist would I become a journalist in this climate today? When I first started, I started at CBS News in New York right out of college, just as a general newsroom jerk. And then I was told by people who were really good there that you needed to go to a newspaper to work. They said, they'll never teach you anything here at CBS. They'll make a producer out of you. And he said, that's the end of your life. Some people wanted to be producers, but I thought I had a face made for television, and I was abused of that. I was disabused of that pretty quickly. So newspapers were much better. I had a face for newspaper, or what's the expression? You had a face for radio.
Face for radio,
yeah. In any event, lots of good people out there willing to help you. When I was coming up, a guy made friends with me. And he was a star at CBS. And you're probably all mostly too young to remember him. His name was Charles Kuralt. And, he started the CBS Sunday morning show, and he was on the road for CBS for years. And I got to know him there, and he gave me great advice, and came to Wisconsin when he was doing stories here, and would call, and we'd have lunch. And he was the first person who ever said to me, if I were you and you wanted to be me, he said, I'd spend as much time as possible with really old people. The older, the better. said, the more irascible, the better. The more unfiltered, the better. He said, it's absolutely a gold mine, a treasure trove of maybe I come up with another trite saying, but anyway, there's a lot of material there. And I've subscribed to that forever. Although young people are okay, although as Kuralt once said, I once went to lunch with him when he was in Madison one day and gave a speech at the UW-Madison, and a young friend of mine who worked for, I was young at the time as well, worked for Wisconsin Public Radio, said, can I come along? And I said, of course. And we went to State Street, and we had what was called a fancy hot dog. Tiffany, this will appeal to you. It's called bratwurst. And it was actually called the Brat House. And Kuralt kept saying, whoa, these hot dogs are really fancy here in Wisconsin. And I could tell that this young guy at the table was just chafing at the bit to ask a question. And he finally said, Mr. Kuralt, and he said this with attitude. He said, you know, every single story you told on stage today at the University of Wisconsin before that packed house was about some old person. You know, what is it with you and old people? And Kuralt was probably 50 at the time. And Kuralt finished his fancy hot dog and said to the kid, he said, oh, that's an easy question to answer. He said, I like young people. They're nice. I even have some of my own. But he said, I don't find them interesting at all, you know. He said, so, you know, maybe in 25 or 30 years, you'll have something interesting to say, but right now, not so much. And he went back to finishing his soup, so.
What's that?
There's a tip. Find somebody who's old and listen to them, because they'll absolutely, you know, trip your trigger, I guarantee it.
Well, we have another question from the crowd. This one is for Tiffany. And it is right now in Indigenous storytelling, Indigenous media, I guess, or, you know, books and poetry and fiction and nonfiction, there seems to be a lot of traumatic experiences that are being written about. And this person asked, how can humor in Indigenous storytelling become as popular as that trauma?
I think that a lot of that, you know, you read a lot of Native American literature, and it seems like it's very traumatic, and it deals with a lot of traumatic events, much like a lot of literature does. But it seems a lot more prevalent in Native literature, probably because we don't have as much of it out there. But within all of those, there's extraordinary humor, and it's more subtle, it's more hidden, it's not like put out front, because it seems like our tragedies sort of sell better, because it just fits into this like little tidy little niche of what the audiences or what readers seem to want or expect. They have an expectation, and, you know, publishing, you know, rises to meet that expectation of atrocity, and, you know, people want to read about that. But within those books, you know, like Louise Erdrich, she's hilarious, you know, she'll, you know, like in The Roundhouse, which is a very somber subject matter. She also has these little, you know, vignettes within that novel that are really, really bizarre and hilarious. That's just one example. There's just a lot of humor. It just abounds in a lot of those books. But, you know, I would like to see more humor come out. I'd like to see more writers, you know, trying that out, and more Native writers, you know, putting that up front. It seems like it's a lot more popular in Canada, because there's a lot more subject matter in Canada. So I've seen people like Dawn Dumont, and she writes really, really funny stuff, really devastating stuff. And you know, just people like that. Yeah.
One other little tip that I think is, this sounds so trite, but I think it's true, is just to be observant. Just to be observant. There's so much humor. My mother used to say that you'll always find great humor in someone's personal story. And so take the time to mine the depths of somebody's personality, that people want to tell their stories. And I used to, for a long time, kept something funny would happen, and I didn't know what it was going to end up being, if anything, but I kept a notebook for years with funny things that happened. And I remember, I'll try to make this really short. I remember that when I was just about out of money, and I was like 25, and I was trying to make it as a writer, which is hard. I got an assignment from like Parade magazine to write a story about a couple, an elderly couple in Wisconsin, who had turned their home into a bird hospital. So wounded birds would come to their hospital. And so I went and wrote the story, and they had a particular bird that they really liked, and the bird's name was Robbie. He was a robin. There's a big, I've given it away. And it was really fun to see them. And you could tell they were a couple that did not have any children. And so I wrote the story, and I got paid, and I remember, like a dutiful son, I sent it to my mother in New Jersey, and she said, "That's good." She said, "But those people think that bird is their kid." And my mother, who was nobody's idea of normal by any means. I loved her dearly, but she was not normal. She considered herself the universal but unrecognized arbiter of normal. She said to me, "But I'll tell you one thing, those people are not normal with that bird." And I went back years later and saw this lady, and her husband had died. And we sat down in her kitchen, and, it's sort of like I asked her how she was doing, and then finally I got around to asking her. I said, "Whatever happened to old Robbie?" Because at the time that I visited her, she'd had that bird for 17 years inside her house. He got well and then refused to leave. And so she said, he died, very matter-of-factly, like we do in Wisconsin. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that." And she said, "Would you like to see him?" And I thought she was going to pull out a picture of him, or his graduation ceremony or his first communion or something. And I said, "Well, of course." And instead, she went over to the freezer and opened it up and pushed aside some mixed vegetables and lima beans and pulled out this little Hallmark card box and brought it over. And she was well into her 80s then, and put it right in front of me at the kitchen table. And then she started to scrape the frozen ice off the top. And there, lying, deader than a mackerel, was the Robbie lying on a bed of eternal Easter grass. And she said, I just loved him, and he was such a good boy. And she looked at me, and I said, "Oh, I thought he was a really good boy." And so this is the kind of conversation we're having. And finally, she after she told me this story, and I went back and wrote the story, I sent it to my mother, of course, and my mother said, "I'll tell you one thing, that woman is not normal." I remember keeping this journal of just odd things that happened. And I sound like I'm a funeral parlor director, but when my dad died, I'll never forget standing in front of the coffin as all these people. He was a very popular guy, knew everybody, and they were filing by. And when people are in a situation like that, and this is part of where everything eventually becomes funny, they walk past the casket, and they, not knowing what else to say to me, they always used to say, they didn't always use, they said at that time, they said, "Well, he looks good. He looks good." And I said, "Well, yeah, except he's dead now." But otherwise, and when I sat with her, that old lady, that was, 20 years later, and she showed me the bird, and she was just smiling down at this little dead bird. The only thing I could think of to say was, "He looks good. He looks really good." And I said, "He doesn't look any the worse for wear, that frozen Robbie." And so, some people wouldn't think that was funny, but I thought it was very funny, actually. And I decided at the end of it that rather than be my mother's son, I said, if that dead bird being kept in a freezer gave that little old lady some measure of comfort, then I was absolutely for it. I thought that was just fine. So I learned these, as my mother used to say, humor is learned at your mother's knee and other joints. So I learned that from my mom, and I kept that, and then I was able to use it years later. So
Cool. So I think we'll do one more question, and we can start with Tiffany on this one, because Steve, I think I have an idea on the answer. Question is, when you...
I've talked enough. How's that?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, when you write, do you have a predetermined audience? And I imagine when you were writing your column, Steve, your audience was people in the Midwest who want to read about other people in the Midwest, weird or funny or endearing or otherwise. How about you, Tiffany? When you write, do you have an audience in mind?
I don't really have an audience in mind. When I write, I just, is it funny to me? So I guess that I would be, the person that would have to pass that muster or that litmus test. How is it coming across just, to my own ears? But, they always ask audiences that question. I mean, they always ask writers that question, and I never really have a good answer for it. Eventually, publishers always ask authors, who's your audience too, when you have to fill out their forms, it's like a lot of academics read my work. I hope that Native Americans read my work. And for the most part, a lot of women read my work, women like myself, humorists, and just readers. And the community at large too. Sometimes somebody will pop up though that I wouldn't expect to read my work. Like if I'm late at night Googling myself, and I'll see somebody like from like the really far stretches of Canadian wilderness, writing something on their blog about my book or something, and it's just surprising. It's surprising who ends up looking at your stuff. And I'll just leave it at that.
Hey, Chad, can I mention one other thing? Because I forgot to, and that is when you asked about people who have influenced you and young writers. I was not in the least bit influenced by Stephen King. That's just not a genre that appeals to me. But anybody who's in this audience tonight, of these thousands of people who tuned in, I would say that Stephen King wrote a book called On Writing, a really clever, maybe you guys have read it, but I think it's probably the best thing I ever read about writing. He not only tells you, he eventually gets to the point where he tells you about, here's some things you ought to do to become a really good writer, and how this is how he functions, and this is what his days are like, etc. But I would argue that the first half of that book, which is all strictly autobiography, if you remember it, Stephen King is a hysterically funny writer and so clever. I've read it, I think, 2 or 3 times. I really, really enjoy it. So anybody who aspires to write, I wish that many years ago that book was around, On Writing by Stephen King. And even if you don't like his brand of fiction, I think he's spectacular, and it's absolutely chock full of really good advice. The end.
All right. Actually, I think that will be the end. I
just meant the end for me because I want to eat.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it's past Steve's dinner time, so we are going to wrap things up. But once again, both of our guests will be joining us again this weekend. Steve will be joining us at 10 a.m. on Saturday to talk more about Dairylandia, and Tiffany will be joining us at 3 p.m. on Sunday, the 27th, to talk more about not only Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's, but also to share some poems from the new collection that will be coming out soon. You can find more information about it. Same as you probably joined this event, you can go to the book festival website, mcpl.us/CWBF, and just click attend on any of the events down there to to join us. So, well, for me, I would say thank you both very much for joining us this evening. This has been fun. You've given me some smiles and some laughs, and appreciate it very much. Danielle, if you want to have the last word.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us from your living rooms or your basement or wherever you are. It's really nice that we could all get together even while we're apart. So thank you both for coming.
And thanks for inviting me. It's good to be invited anywhere these days. But another thing you could that writers should always be aware of is that I think they ought to be grateful. It's a wonderful thing to be doing, and for someone to acknowledge it, I'm very grateful for that. So, so thank you for having me. And Tiffany, I give you the vote for the best book title. Bury my heart. I don't know what that's about. I haven't read, but I'm going to find out. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. It's terrific. Good night.
I take that back. I will have the last word, unless Tiffany, you have anything you care to? No, shaking your head. No. Okay. All right. We are recording this, and so we'll have it up. Our book festival also has its own YouTube page, so we'll get it up there for a little bit, starting on Monday. And we'll have it up for a little bit. So. If you joined us and enjoyed the conversation, tell your friends, and we'll be sure to promote all of the videos once they're uploaded and all of that. So, all right, we'll call it a night then. Good night, Gracie, as Mr. Burns used to say. And yes, thanks again, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. So, good night.